morning, everybody out in the world on Sunday morning. Welcome back to the second day of the Bold Strokes Bookathon UK. We're excited to have you with us today. We've got a whole load of great authors and panels and readings and discussions. So we hope you'll come back and stick with us throughout the day. Remember to go over to the Bold Strokes website and register for all the panels you want to be on. This morning we've got the amazing Jane Fletcher and the amazing Cari Hunter who will be chatting with you. And we will see you for the panel. I'll see you for the panel next. So over to you guys.
Good morning, world.
Oh, it's just the two of us. Vic's gone. Good morning. Good morning to everybody who's tuned in at this time as well. I'm very impressed that you've managed to get out of bed for 11 o'clock or whatever time it is in the States. I have no idea what time it is in the rest of the world. Early.
It's at 6 on the East Coast. Yes,
I think somebody mentioned 3 o'clock. So on that theme, Jane, I have to ask the pressing question of the morning. Did you actually get dressed for this, or are you wearing your jammies secretly?
I think the phrase is referred to Donald ducking, where you're actually only wearing a top and you kind of still keep the bottom bottoms on.
Well, I just put a nice T-shirt on and then just took it off again because you can't see it anyway.
Yeah. No, I am actually dressed.
Yeah, me too. I've been on the cross trainer this morning. I've been quite industrious. I was just telling Vic. Right, so books.
3 cups of tea.
Jane, tell anybody who doesn't know anything about your books what your books are about, what you tend to sort of like write, what you like, what genre you're in.
I tend to do a very high genre as dykes with swords, and I don't care what Freud would have made of it. It's mainly fantasy, though I kind of shade into science fiction sometimes, but it's definitely fantasy, made-up worlds that I prefer working with. And I've got my 13th book is out next month. And so, Cari, what genre do you write?
I tend to write crime thriller. I think I found my niche, because every time I try to write something too romancy, it always ends up being there's a thriller story in the background. I can't help myself, even with my last one, which I tried to lighten the tone a little bit, and it has got more humour in than anything else. This is Breathe I'm talking about. I still ended up killing somebody reasonably early in it, and it turned into kind of a murder mystery, even despite myself, really. So, yeah, I think I like the idea of putting 2 protagonists who've never met before in quite a close kind of peril, really. So things like Snowbound and Desolation Point, Alias are quite typical for that. Breathe to some extent, and then I've got the Dark Peak crime series as well in the background, which was different in that it was a series, so less of, well, obviously not a standalone. Each mystery was contained, but the actual story, the overarching character stuff developed through the 3 books. So can we just say before we get into the nitty-gritty of this that Jane and I have known each other for quite a long time. Jane's been writing with Bold Strokes now for how many years, Jane?
Well, back since the beginning, pretty much. 2004 was it? Rad said it started. So since 2005, that would be. I was about 4 months.
I can't remember when Snowbound came out, but I'm kind of averaging 1 book a year, so it's about 8 years ago. But even before then, my partner and I were little fangirls of Jane. We used to go to the York Lesbian Arts Festival, which was probably the most literary lesbians you will ever see crammed into one room, which was amazing. And we met Jane there, and she signed one of her books. Well, she signed about 4 of her books, but this is one of her very early books before she was with Bold Strokes, and it is autographed. All the best, Jane. I don't know. Do you even remember that? Yeah, you won't remember meeting us, will you?
No.
Honestly, it's fine to say no.
No, I am. Though, given how few people's books actually ended up signing, you think I would remember a few more people, but yeah.
Weird, because Wylaf was instrumental.
Old now, my memory's going.
Wylaf was instrumental in me signing with Bold Strokes, because Rad was there at least a couple of times, I think, and listening to her speak about Bold Strokes made them my number one for sending Snowbound into. So without Wylaf, there would have been no Cari Hunter, probably. Anyway, right, let's get back to the books. You are a world builder, am I right?
Yes, I like creating my own worlds. And
Where do you start?
I like creating worlds just for the freedom. There's a lot of nitty gritty that you get into when you're writing in the real world. My last book, and this book that's coming out, both start in the real world, and you have to get your details right. And I know the Isle of Broken Years. It starts in a very specific place on a Spanish galleon in March of 1631, sailing out to the New World. And some research I had to do, things like, how many masts are there on a Spanish galleon? Who was Pope in 1631? There's a lot of details that probably people aren't too worried about from the point of view of the book. But if you get it wrong, people will notice and care. One great thing about writing fantasy and making my own world is that I don't need to worry. The details can be whatever I want. I also claim that one time I was writing a book, and the plot, I needed like 4 days to get from one place to somewhere else on a boat downriver. And so I did a little bit of research and worked out how fast a boat would likely be travelling, and realised it would only be about 2.5 days. I just got my rubber, rubbed out the map, and put an extra big, large loop in, so it would be 4 days. That sort of freedom to make the world what the plot needs is wonderful, and you can't do it when you're tied down to real worlds. I can balance
in a way, but I know what you're saying. You kind of can manipulate, even if you're sort of writing in the real world like I do, you can manipulate the details. I mean, I'm quite careful sometimes in where I'll set things. So I might use something like the Snake Pass, which absolutely does exist, and Manchester and Sheffield, which absolutely do exist. And yet, like, a little village that one of my characters lives in will be fictional, so I can design that myself. So you're kind of world building even when you're sort of grounded in reality. I'm always quite cautious about using small places. I don't know why, it makes me quite nervous, whereas a big city like Manchester I can describe in detail, but I don't know about some small places I tend to avoid. I'll make my own small places up, and I don't really know why that is. But
in a small place, you're actually going to be kind of tied down. Like if there's a pub and there's an argument there, there's a real pub landlord who might pick up on it. But I want to say with the Snake Pass, my wife and I were up in holiday in the Peak District, and we were driving over the Snake Pass, and we had one of your audiobooks, one of the Dark Peak ones, on at the time as we were going over the Snake Pass. So we got a bit of extra background atmosphere in as we were listening to the books, which were excellent.
I think that's a perfect place to listen to the audios is driving over the Snake Pass in the mist. It has to be in the mist as well. I can't think of anything better, really. But yeah, I think
I was driving audios... sunny. I prefer driving over the Snake Pass. I can see where I'm going, to be honest.
See, that's somewhere that I'll put in the book. You know, I know a lot of curves on that route. So that absolutely exists. Santa's Cottage, every time we go walking, we see a cottage that I always say is Santa's Cottage, because it is literally just off the Snake Pass. Probably a little bit bigger than she could afford, but yeah, it is there. And it's weird as well, in Snowbound, there's a barn, and every time we go walking near Jacob's Ladder in the Peak District, there's a barn there that I always say is the Snowbound barn. I actually designed the barn in Snowbound based on that. So, yeah. I do mix the realism in there. There are places. You can go to the Snake pub for a drink. It's just called the Snake Inn, but it does exist. So what, in terms of research versus just sort of like making stuff up, what percentage of each do you admit to? What do you do and what do you sort of like take off?
Obviously, the length of the rivers I'm totally making up. How fast a boat travels. I do actually have research books. There's actually one of my classic go-to books is Travel in the Ancient World by Lionel. Actually, and that is actually a fascinating research book. I mean, I do have research books for things like travel. How far can an ox cart go in one day? Those sort of, as long as I'm not making up a new imaginary animal to be pulling the cart. If I'm going to use an ox or a horse, I need to know. I've done research on how far horses travel in a day. Different metal. I will do research into pretty much anything, and if I can't do the research, I make it up.
to get from southeast London to a random postcode in Solihull. It's about 2.5 hours if you're interested. But yeah, I'm really scared of getting stuff wrong, and I will always try and Jerry Wheeler wants to know, Jane, is that boat laden or unladen?
I think I went quite into that much detail.
Do a variation of each. Yeah. How many sword wielding lesbians were on the boat at the time of it making its 2-hour journey down the river that you've invented? Somebody has asked in the side here, what was the inspiration for the all-female world of the Solano series? This is ZW's asked that.
That one is just, it's a fun world to play around with. It's one of the things I like creating worlds is that I can stack the deck the way I want it. I can create a world where being a female isn't an issue, being a lesbian isn't an issue. And then what are the issues? There's quite a lot of all-female worlds if you look at lesbian science fiction. I'm not the first person to have created one. A lot of them, you have these worlds, I say, where they're all 6 foot tall, wise, vegetarian, pacifist Amazons, led by even wiser, white-haired, ancient women. And I would say, no, I've met too many women I don't like to think that just getting rid of men's going to get rid of all the problems in the world. So in part, it was reacting against some of the books that are just a little bit too utopian. And utopias aren't really that much fun to write about because everything's perfect and wonderful. And it's the imperfections, people's problems and foibles that make interesting characters to write. A little bit too bland. Have, one perfect world that's all female, and there's the non-all-female world that it's in conflict with. If you put all rightness and goodness on one side and all evil on the other, it's way too simplistic a conflict for me to really get my imagination going.
I mean, there's this sort of like female utopia idea, isn't it, that crops up. I can't remember, was it the ISIS books years ago? I remember reading that series, and that was a very. I think we've got a better balance now. I try and I get fed up with lesbic writers who all men are evil, and I try to have a really good cast of non-evil men in my books. I mean, a lot of the sort of criminal protagonists can be male, although I have had female protagonists who've been serial killers or whatever. But I go out of my way to write good male characters. People like Nelson, and the police partners tend to be just normal, good bloke, straight males. I think there is a balance to be redressed there sometimes. But yeah, it is difficult to know what people are looking for at times, and to know what people are okay with reading as well. But I think there's so much variety out there now with lesfic that you can get away with pushing whatever you want to write, basically. Which is, I mean, we're both genre writers, aren't we? We don't write within your typical sort of like romance, genre definition. So yeah,
you're sort of saying that that you tend to write, mainly action. Most of my stories, there's action, there's a plot, and the romance tends to be a subplot. It adds an extra dynamic to my two main characters, but I tend to be primarily writing action. Sometimes I get criticism that there's just not enough romance to it, but I find a pure romance very difficult to write. They have that much emphasis on the people. It's rather than just sort of saying that the main character is brave and heroic and wonderful, which is why that person B has fallen in love with them. If you're writing an action adventure, you can show them being brave, dynamic, and everything else to make it easier, I thought, why the other character might fall for them. It really just gives you a chance to have your main characters shining as they overcome adversity and show themselves to be worthwhile, admirable people. And that adventure side to it, the romance, I find, makes it that much easier. Rather than just telling your audience that they're wonderful, you can show them being wonderful.
And the thing that I like to read as well. It's difficult to write something that you don't enjoy reading. So I don't enjoy fluffy romances. I know thousands, millions of people do, and that's absolutely brilliant. But I don't enjoy reading them, so I'm not going to, spend a year writing one really. somebody here has asked, where was that question? It was something about how do you decide how much romance goes into a crime/fantasy book? Do you feel obliged to put the romance in there because of the expectations of the reader, or does it just happen as a, you know, sort of like an integral part of the book?
It's usually the way I'm imagining. Certainly, if I'm writing for Bold Strokes, I'm writing for a lesbian publisher for a lesbian audience, I will put at least lesbians in it. I'm not sure that I could ever write one that didn't have a romance, though that's not impossible. But if there wasn't lesbians and some sort of that element of it, the tendency would then probably will just not write it as a straight fantasy and go to a mainstream press.
I think there is a definite pressure from readers to include a romance and a happy ever after. And it's something that I've taken a bit of flack for in the past myself, particularly with the Dark Peak books, which weren't a romance. They weren't advertised as a romance, they were advertised as crime, and yet people still, because it was lesbian fiction, and lesfic is synonymous with romance, they still expected that happy ever after at the end of the novel. In fact, even my editor was nervous about the fact that Meg and Sana weren't a couple at the end of that book. And she, at the editing, when the editing process came around, she basically said, you know, we need to put some kind of at least hope in there for their relationship, if not make them a happy ever after couple. And it was at that point, because the editing comes in, I don't know whether people know, but the editing comes in quite a long time after you've written your story. So I was already most of the way through Cold to the Touch, which is the second book, by the time the editing for No Good Reason came around. So I had to break it to her quite gently that I'd already broken Sana and Meg up in the second book. So there was no way I could give them a happy ever after at the end of the first. So she's like, okay, then let's see what we can do. So I think I took a reference out to Sana and Meg going chasing lovely Greek lesbians around on their sunny holiday island at the end of the book. And that was enough to just sort of like, you know, give them the kind of almost a conclusion to their relationship for anybody who didn't want to read book 2. But yeah,
I love the characters and I love their relationship. It was a complex up and down relationship. There was enough spark and fire in it to keep me interested. The beats of a romance are not actually essential for me to enjoy a book. I did enjoy reading those characters and the way they were interacting.
What was so gratifying about that series was some readers were happy to play the long game with me. So they were happy to sort of like take the peaks and the troughs. You know, you've got this couple who know each other so well. They've been together since childhood. They've been friends since childhood. You know, they had their first kiss when they were, 10, 11 or so. So they've got all that shared history. And I think it's lovely to write, you know, characters like that. You've got all that detailed background. And then have them absolutely terrified of making a commitment to each other because they don't want to bugger up what they've got in terms of their friendship. You know, it's a friendship with benefits which suits them right up until the point that it doesn't suit them, and then they need to do something about it. So
I think there's often you can only really run a romance once. You know, the couple meet, they fall in love, they overcome any problems, they get together. That's the end of the romance. If you're going to do a series, you cannot then have to go through the whole sequence again in the next book and the next book. So you actually need a different, more complex relationship that can go through peaks and troughs over a series of books. And I would love it if you could write some more. I think we love the characters. I would love to. Yeah, it was a great series, and we would love some more.
For a fourth book, it just makes me really nervous. I've always said never say never, and there's a small short story on my blog that I wrote for a couple of Christmases ago that kind of picks up where they were, you know, a couple of years later. But I don't know whether I'd ever go back and write another novel with them both because I don't want to bugger it up. I don't know, you know, I just don't want to muck it up. I think I like where it ended. I like where they were at the end of A Quiet Death, and I will be terrified of you know, people really looking forward to a fourth book and then being disappointed. I don't want to disappoint people. So.
I'm looking down at some of the questions. We've got one from Morgan Fracknell asking if we're plotters or pantsters. How would you classify yourself?
Does everybody know what the term means? I mean, it's one that crops up loads of times on sort of panels. A plotter is basically somebody who knows exactly. Jane is, oh my God, Jane plots. you plot your book out, basically. You know what's going to happen chapter by chapter, and a pantser is somebody who doesn't and flies by the seat of pants and makes it up as they go along. So, plotter, how would you do it?
I mean, I would say with plotting, it's actually that I do the first draft in my head. I work out the plot, I make sure it all fits together. And it's not the individual details. I don't need to know what colour somebody's underpants were that day. Or even if a conversation, I didn't even know where that conversation takes place. I know there has to be a conversation where person A tells person B something that will cause them to do something else. And for me, it's the plot arc that I have sorted in my head. The first thing I ever commit to paper is actually breaking that arc into scenes. So I had scene A, scene B, and make sure that every element of the plot arc fits in somewhere logically in that sequence. So the first thing I'm actually writing is almost like, one sentence scene summaries of what's happening. And I just keep expanding it from there. I then do like, a 1 page per scene summary of what happens. And then you just basically write it out in full. So I don't tend to get writer's block. I'm never looking at a blank page thinking, God, what's going to happen next? If I don't know what's happened next, I've not even started thinking about putting it onto paper.
So disciplined you actually stick to that? There are no points where you think, you know what, I'll add another sword fight. We need dragons.
It will sometimes it will change a little bit. It usually actually changes most on my what I call my first edit, because I'll write the whole thing out. I'll then put the book aside for ideally 6 months, certainly at least 3 or 4 months. I'll then go back and read it, which I would say it was when I see what I've written rather than what I thought I was writing at the time. And I tend sometimes to realize something mostly more taking stuff out. I've made a bit just too complicated, and I've got people running there and there and think, actually, these two scenes need to go together. This information here, cut that whole scene out. It's just only one paragraph that's important, stick it somewhere else. There will be a little bit of shuffling things around, but not hugely. It never goes off down a different alley. The book...
I'm terrible. I have no discipline. I am completely undisciplined when it comes to writing a book. I do try to plot, especially with a series. I had an idea of where the characters were going in the Dark Peak books, but otherwise I am too prone, I think, to being distracted by other ideas. So I will plot something and I will have lots of notes, and there will literally be notes on like scraps of paper, because I'm also terrible at keeping myself organized. And then I will just decide halfway through that I need to put a fight in here or a little bit of action in here or something, and it'll just go off on a whole different tangent to what I'd anticipated, which is good sometimes, because I think you can overplot.
The issue with, I think both have had the experience recently of starting a book and getting several tens of thousand words into it and then realise it's not really working and stopping. And for me, I had the book plotted and it's following the plot. And I kind of roughly estimate how many words I think it's going to take. And I realised I was like, 30,000 words, that's me, that's a third of the book in, and not a lot had happened. And I was worried that it was just going way too slow. And so I thought, okay, I had another idea for a book, which is Silver Ravens, which is the book that's coming out next month. So I put the other one aside, which is a provisional title of A Fox in Shadow. And I went back and looked at it, and I realised, it wasn't as slow as I thought it was, but it's much more character-driven than my normal stuff. And my narrative distance was far too far back. I was telling too much. I actually need to get inside the two main characters' heads a lot more. It's a book I want to write. It's a book I'm going to write. And once I get my arse in gear, I will write it and finish off. But I do need to just get 2 steps closer to the characters, which I think was the main issue.
I'm not sure what the main issue was. I think it was a combination of 2 things. I'd started it intending it to be the start of a new series. It was going to be another police procedural, with completely different characters to the Dark Peak series, which was always in the back of my head as well. How do I keep it distinct from the Dark Peak series? So there was pressure on it to be different, but also to be as well liked. And then I was writing it, and I tried to plot and I tried to plan. And I don't know whether I put a little bit too much into that and it stopped being fun. And then Breathe came out in the middle of it. And I think I was expecting, I thought I'd written quite a sweet little romance with Breathe that was going to be, you know, well liked. I didn't think there was anything particularly offensive in it that would piss anybody off. And I picked up some really quite vitriolic reviews over it, and it just knocked my confidence. It stopped me writing for a while. It stopped me writing for maybe about 8 weeks. And I just didn't want to pick up a pen again. And it was just, you know, by and large, it was a real minority of people, but they'd been so bitter about it that it just was like, oh, really? Why do I bother? So I put that story aside because it just wasn't working at the time. And I think it would have been any story that I was working on at the time that had that kind of impact. So I got another little idea and ran with that instead. And I'm now about 35,000 words into it, maybe. So getting to around a halfway point. And I'm really enjoying it. But like Jane, I will go back to that other story because it was good. And I was, you know, I like the characters and I think they've got quite a lot to say. So it's on hold. It's not in the bin. Jerry in the Q&A, actually, that was one that I wanted to go back to, was asking about action scenes, which I think we can both answer because we're both quite action-y orientated at times. So Jane, how do you go about writing your action scenes? How do you choreograph them?
Usually because I know what needs to happen in any given action scene. Somebody needs to die, somebody needs to get lost, somebody needs to fall off a cliff. And depending on what needs to happen, that will pretty much determine the choreography. As I say, when I'm initial plotting, I may not have actually tied it down to a particular scene. I may also be thinking, okay, it's going to happen on a hilltop, and actually it'd be much better if it happened down a mine. And if it's happening down a mine, the choreography is going to be different. Although I will actually tend to know whether I'm in a mine or in a hilltop before I actually get to it. That's somewhere midway through my plotting process, so things will be shifting then. But by the time I actually come to write, I've usually got a fairly good idea that's going to be determined by location and where it starts. But it's a programmer. I was a computer programmer. You have your start point, your end point, and what happens in the middle. And I know it starts off with characters A, B, and C, and it's going to end up one situation. It's going to end up with these characters in a different situation, and a degree of action is going to get them from one to the other. And depending on location, it's pretty straightforward. I don't tend to go much beyond that. Unless you get down to the individual thing, like whose arms where. And that's
I thought you were going to say you and Joni had like swords and you enacted it all in the living room, and now I'm disappointed in that you just do it all in your head.
My lovely assistant is about to produce a prop.
You actually have a sword. Amazing.
Actually, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 around the room.
That doesn't explain the skull, I hope.
No, Joni did that.
In terms of my action, what do? I imagine it in my head, but I think I'm quite good at being quite brutal in my head as well. So I want a punch to hurt. You know, I'm not into writing really superwoman characters. So if Sana, you know, takes a hit, it actually makes her bleed and it'll knock her to the floor. And she might end up with a bit of concussion or something like that. You know, you don't just get yourself up and shake yourself off and carry on. So I really always want to do down and dirty fights. Like the fight at the end of Cold to the Touch, I just wanted Sana to have a proper good scrap. And she has a proper good scrap with the main perp in Cold at the end of it. When there's fingernails flying and pepper spray being pushed and knives slashing at people. But yeah, it just, if I write violence, I want there to be consequences as well. Because I mean, obviously I work as a paramedic, so I see the consequences of violence and I don't ever want to gloss over it. Which is one reason, weirdly, I mean, we were talking about what books we like reading and you've got a massive array of books behind you, but it's one reason I actually stopped reading mainstream crime and started kind of writing my own, because I just got so sick of the kind of one-upmanship in terms of the gore in mainstream crime. You know, it's not, most of it's not grounded in realism. You just, I don't know, the serial killers are so outlandish. So I always try to sort of, you know, make my criminals, people that you could bump into on the street. I think that just makes them scarier. So, but yeah, I did stop reading. I did stop reading mainstream crime after a while. I used to love it. I used to read a load of pot boilers, but not anymore. Do you read fantasy? Are you genre-wise in terms of your reading? Do you stick with what you write, or
I love. I mean, I was a fantasy reader, science fiction reader. I trying to get when the last real fantasy book I read though. I tend to have forget who was talking yesterday. Was saying, no, as a writer, you then start nitpicking, or you're reading something and think, no, how did their editor let them get away with that? Alternatively, start analysing, oh, it's really good how they've brought this character in here. But with fantasy books, I tend to have issues with things like, the Dark Lord and the servants of the Dark God. It's because I think at heart everybody believes they're on the side right. They'll go through weird mental gymnastics to convince themselves that what they're doing is right. I mean, like Hitler didn't think he was being evil. He thought he was purifying the human race, and people in years to come would thank him for it. We can see that actually he was an evil bastard, but in his own head, he thought he was on the side of right. And how people justify themselves is interesting. And if you're worshipping the god of evil, you've got no self-justification in there. So everybody will convince themselves they are right. And they make the fun characters. They're the fun evil characters. And I think maybe I just read one too many fantasy books with, it's the Lord of Evil who's going to destroy the world. I want something a little bit more complex than that in my bad guy's motivation.
Right, I'm just going to have to address this. Because it says, AComp has said, can you both speak a bit to your background and interest in writing? Cari sounds like she has a Liverpool accent and Jane a proper English London accent. Do you ever consider different UK dialects or accents in general in your storytelling with your characters in mind? Okay, that kind of one for me, I think, that one. First of all, my accent is not Liverpudlian. It's northern, but it's not Liverpudlian. It's kind of Manchester mixed with maybe a bit of Lee, which was near where I was born and brought up. But yeah, around kind of Oldham and Manchester, and now I live in the Peak District. So it's got a bit mangled, but it's definitely not Liverpudlian. In terms of dialect, again, I would very much recommend the audio books of my books to get an idea of how the characters should sound when they speak. Because the narrator, Nikki Vincent, is from Hebden Bridge, so she's a Yorkshire lass, and she is amazing with the dialect and the dialogue. So basically my characters kind of speak a little bit like me, and then with a bit of a Sheffield accent, which again is quite distinct. My missus is useless at distinguishing one accent from another. It'll be on telly and they'll be going toe, and I'll say, well, that's a Yorkshire accent. She's like, how do you tell? So because it is, you can tell it's a Yorkshire accent. But yeah, I am probably best known really for writing a lot of slang in my books, a lot of British slang. I have never ever entertained the thought of writing a book set in Northern England and not having my characters talk like Northern English people. I know that, the Bold Strokes readership is largely American, and again, it's something I get quite a lot of stick for, but I can't change that. I just can't. I can't have people set in Manchester and have them talk like somebody who comes from Philadelphia, even if it would broaden my appeal in terms of readership, and probably annoy less people as well. But then on the other, on the other side of that, there's people who really like the slang and love being able to swear fluently in British now, and they know what a butty is and a brew, and it's something that people expect now, I think. So again, it's a trope that I'm never going to get away from, and don't want to, I don't think. Do you find it easier, Jane, in terms of setting your sort of like characters in your own worlds? You can decide how they speak.
Obviously, I haven't got issues with the accents and such. I do have a combination of issues. One, people kind of expect them fantasy people to talk like medieval lords and stuff. And then there was one story I was reading, and I got a book of Elizabethan slang, criminal slang, which I thought was great. I could throw this in, and suddenly realised that no reader was going to have a clue what they were saying. That there is an issue with reader expectations of how people would speak in a medieval setting. And the trouble is, so much of people's characterization comes from how they speak, that the characters just not going to come through. If somebody's crude and swearing a lot, medieval obscenities will not really have that same punch. But I did have the thing with the book The Shoe Stone, which I was writing, and I was speaking English, modern English. And I had the backstory. There had been this big empire that had controlled the whole area, and there had been a language that I was kind of thinking like Latin. And you had Vulgar Latin, you had High Latin. During the Roman Empire, everyone was kind of, mostly people were meant to speak a common form of Latin. So I think, okay, it's a few hundred years later, but there is an older form of the language that scholars and aristocrats might speak, and then there's the common form. And I was, for the old form of the language, I was using my best fantasy gobbledygook, which any fantasy writer throws in, like nonsensical words with lots of K's and apostrophes in it. And so I thought, well, hang on, this older form of the language would have the same relationship to modern English that Old English has to modern English. So instead of using gobbledygook, I actually wrote, there's only a few sentences, maybe about 10 sentences in the book. I've actually written them in Old English. So if anybody's reading The Shoe Stone and wants to know what's being said, if you run it through an Old English translator, you will actually get what people are saying in the old language. Generally speaking, Bolstrokes, they don't like you using foreign languages unless you're really adept at them. And I sort of say, well, can I get a pass on Old English, given that there's nobody else who can speak, who can come back and tell me that I've used the wrong...
You're going to find an editor in Old English, are you?
Although one of the BSB writers is actually a lecturer in I think, Anglo-Saxon English. So I did actually run the sentences past her just to make sure I wasn't getting anything too horribly wrong.
Interesting. We've got a random question. How do we get Netflix to make your books into a mini-series? I'm not sure who it's to. Who would you cast? If you had to pick one of your books to sort of like, or one of your series to go into a mini-series, who would you cast as your lead?
I've got no idea, and apart from anything else, even if I did have an idea, I'm lousy at remembering actors and actresses' names. It'd be, the one who played so-and-so in what's it? No.
Oh, that one?
Yeah.
See, I've been asked that for the Dark Peak, and I always say I'd just cast unknowns because they're so scruffy and rough around the edges, Meg and Sana. They wouldn't fit with any kind of Hollywood gloss. They'd need to be like little scrubbers. So I would just cast, just unknowns who just came to an audition and were just perfect for it. So I never have, I see authors online and they'll put up a picture of who they've got in mind when they're writing their books, and I have never done that. I've never had any famous person in mind, which probably comes to another question. Somebody's asked whether we put ourselves in any of our characters. Do you do that? Honestly,
I suspect, especially because the characters are coming out of my head, some part of me probably feeds into all the characters. I always say that Gemeril in the Larmouth books is the one closest to me. Arrogant, self-opinionated, and socially inept at times. Actually, quite a lot.
Yeah, there's different bits of me that have found my way into different characters, but there's no one character that's ever been based on me. Not entirely. I mean, there's bits of Sana in me, her nervousness around authority, for instance. There's bits of Meg that I wish were me, because I would love to give some of the shit she gives to Patience. It's just, I use her cathartically to just get some of my frustrations out at times. But the only paramedic that I ever wrote was Jem in Breathe, and I went out of my way not to make her a self-insert, basically. So she's a different body shape to me. She's a chronic asthmatic. She looks different, she talks different. She's kind of sweeter than me. I'm a cynical old sod. But again, there are bits of me in there. There's bits of my history with the ambulance service in there. I don't know whether anybody remembers the bit about her driving where she had L and R written on her hands when she started. That my on-the-job tutor did that to me, because I had this thing where I was so panicked about driving on blues that I would just automatically get left and right wrong. so if she turned, you know, she said to turn left, I would automatically go to the right. So she penned L and R on my hands. It was the most humiliating thing. But I was young at the time. I was young and naive. I've got far more grey hairs now. So
I say there's only ever once that I've consciously based any character in my books on somebody I know in real life. And I'll say in Rangers at Road's End, there's a character who I based on the class bully when I was 13. I made her like 20 years older and put her in a management role that she was totally ill-suited to, and gave her a few traits from some of my least favourite managers I've had over the years. I think it's just wonderfully fun to write it, knowing that halfway through she was going to end up with a knife in the back.
We've had Isabel, who said, what's the best experience you've ever had with a reader at an event or public reading? I mean, obviously, apart from signing our books.
Signing your books.
Which you don't even remember. That stuck with you, or
the first time somebody asked me to autograph one of my books, you know, like, do you really want me to sprawl over this?
It is a very weird thing that I've got such a crap signature. I've never managed to get, because I looked at yours and it's quite cool, and mine's just awful. It's something that anybody could forge. I do apologise to anybody whose books I've ever signed. I have a crap signature, and I can't really change it now either, because, you know, I've signed quite a few books now. And weirdly, seeing as, go on, sir.
I was saying my signature's awful, and I can't actually do a repeatable signature. It looks different every time. Back when you had, you know, the credit cards, you had to sign on the back and match it. The number of times I got called up on this being my signature. The chip and pin has been wonderful for me. So
I like chip and pin until it doesn't work. Weirdly, seeing as Isabel asked the question, she deserves props for bringing me, I think, 2 or 3 bags of my favourite Haribo sweets that we used to be able to get in Aldi over here, and now you can't buy. But she came over from mainland Europe with 3 bags of sweets for me, and I love her dearly for that. Please do continue to bring me Haribo. Jane, and this is a question similar to what we had, actually, or similar to what I had. Your earlier books, we've said, were like 100% fantasy, and yet The Isle of Broken Years and Silver Ravens starts out as it's got history in it. So it's not sort of pure fantasy. And The Isle of Broken Years starts out as kind of historical and then goes into almost like science fiction with the island and the mythology of the island. Was that a deliberate kind of combination? Are you just enjoying twisting genres at the moment? Was it a deliberate thing for you to do?
Well, basically, I mean, Isle of Broken Years was an idea that occurred to me, and so I wanted where I had to start. It wasn't so much I'm going to write something historic. It was just that was where the book started. And the current one, Silver Ravens, actually it's not historic. It starts in the current day. In fact, okay, yeah, Joni said just a moment. Yeah, the prologue is historical, but the main story
starts in history.
Yeah, actually, I was forgetting that. Yeah, the prologue does start, but then it pretty quickly jumps to the modern day. And in fact, if you read the book, you can actually tell which year it starts in. I was suggesting that it probably wasn't best to tie it down to a year, but actually, if you read the book, you can work out which year it is. It's that specific. It's not this year.
In terms of what you're writing as well, you've kind of made quite a noticeable shift away from series of late. You've done maybe 4 standalones on the trot, is it? Is that a deliberate? Yes. Is that a deliberate shift, or do you think you'll go back to writing a series?
I'd like to go back to the Solano series at some stage. It's a great world to play around with. I've got a couple of ideas, 2-3 ideas for books, but it's only it comes in. I'm going to write a book. Which one is forefront in my head? Which one do I most want to write at the moment? And it's never been that that's the one that I most want to write. At the moment, the book I most want to write is the one I started, and I really want to get back to it because it's something that totally intrigues me. I want to play around with it. I've got the plot. I've got to put it out onto words. It's it's the story that I most want to write when I sit down in front of the computer and think, okay, new book time.
Cheerleaders for Solano, more Solano in the comments here. So there's enthusiasm for that.
Mm.
I think it's a different thing completely writing a series, isn't it? It's a commitment, I think. And sometimes a standalone is just, you've got to get everything in that book. And it's kind of fun and scary at the same time, because everything needs telling within sort of like 85, 90,000 words, depending on how long you write. You write probably slightly longer books than I do. But yeah, there's a pressure and there's a kind of tension to getting everything into a standalone, whereas a series, you can take so much more time with the characters to develop their background and their relationships, which is what that's what I really enjoyed. That's what I took away from the series. How much depth you can give characters.
The Solano series is different in that I'm not particularly following any one character. I invented a world and I'm playing around with it and I'm jumping backwards and forwards in time. Listening to a big mistake I've made with that, the first book I wrote was The Temple at Landfall, where I set up how the world gets to be. And I always tell people, if you're going to start the series, that is the book to start with. That is the first one I wrote. That's how I explain why everything is the way it is. I then jump forward in time, backward in time, The fifth book is actually the first one chronologically, in that it's something like 24 years before the first book. But I'll say it's not the one to read first. And it gets it on Goodreads. They give it as Solano #1. Because by the time I got into the fifth book, I no longer wanted to go through the whole background of, this is what the printers were, this was what happened, this is what. And I do get some people having read it saying, they don't understand why I've created this world and they're not explained so much about it, just leaving all these questions. I actually have to write another book that actually predates Shadow of the Night, where I can actually again work in an explanation about why the world is the way it is. But yeah, if you're going to start the Solano series, do not start with Shadow of the Night. Ignore the fact that it's chronologically the first. It really doesn't matter. I'm not following any one character. You need to know what the hell's going on in the world. You should really start probably with Temple at Landfall. If you really must, Walls at Western Port. Just don't try starting anywhere else.
What can we ask to finish off with? I've answered what's the little creature on the shelf above Cari's head. That's my iguana. My wife put it there as a prop. What's next? What's coming up? You've got Silver Ravens, haven't you? When's that out?
That one should be out. It's due to be out and go on sale at the end of the next month. But I already have my author copy. There you go. With a dragon on the cover.
Dragons in it. There's dragons, Jane. Yeah.
There are some dragons. Yeah.
Excellent. When's that out?
That's due to go on sale in July. So a couple of weeks away.
We are taking down here. What we need to mention is that the next panel is Researching the Details at 12 o'clock. So you've got a 10-minute wee break if you are registered to attend that one like I am. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to Jane. Thank you for all of your questions. Apologies if the sound was a bit ropey at times. It's been an absolute pleasure. So I hope some of you will stick around for the next events all day. They're all day. Through to about 7 o'clock this evening. I'm just wave goodbye to everybody in the panels there. It's been great. Thank you.